1923, the reading of Charles Willoughby's will in Boston sent shockwaves through one of New England's most respected families. What should have been a routine distribution of wealth became the first crack in a facade that had concealed one of America's most disturbing family legacies. The will didn't just transfer property and investments. Hidden within its legal language was a cryptic reference to certain family obligations and a sealed trust fund that could only be accessed by maintaining the traditions established by our patriarch. But Charles Willoughby wasn't the patriarch. That distinction belonged to his father, Conrad Willoughby, who had mysteriously disappeared from the family's official records decades earlier. What the family discovered that day in the lawyer's office was that Conrad hadn't just vanished from their genealogy. He had been systematically erased because of what he had done in the frontier towns of the American West. And worse, the family had been profiting from his crimes for over 50 years. This is the story of how 7 generations of one of Boston's elite families built their fortune on a foundation of murder, how they used their wealth and influence to bury the truth, and how their dark inheritance continued to claim victims well into the 20th century. This is the story they spent millions to keep hidden, the investigation they tried to destroy, and the evidence that finally brought their empire of silence crashing down. The Willoughby mansion on Beacon Hill stood as a testament to American success. 4 stories of Georgian brick, perfectly manicured gardens, and a guest list that read like a who's who of Boston society. For 70 years, the family had hosted senators, governors, and captains of industry within those walls. Their charitable foundations funded orphanages, their investments built railroads, and their name appeared on the donor walls of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. But on the morning of October 15, 1923, as family members gathered in the mahogany-paneled library for the reading of Charles Willoughby's will, none of them suspected that their carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Charles had been the family's public face for 3 decades, a silver-haired patriarch who had expanded the family's shipping and real estate empire across New England. His death from pneumonia had been expected, dignified, and properly mourned by Boston's elite. Attorney Jeremiah Morrison, senior partner at Morrison, Adams and Associates, had served the Willoughby family for over 20 years. He was accustomed to their preference for discretion, their insistence on privacy, and their ability to make problems disappear with strategic donations and well-placed phone calls. But as he broke the wax seal on Charles's final testament, Morrison discovered that this particular patriarch had left behind more than instructions for distributing wealth. "To my children and their children," Morrison read aloud, his voice steady despite the growing tension in the room, "I leave not only the material benefits of our family's success, but also the burden of truth. Hidden within this estate are records that document the true source of the Willoughby fortune. These records detail the actions of my father, Conrad Willoughby, whose activities in the territories between 1869 and 1883 provided the initial capital that funded every subsequent generation's prosperity. Margaret Willoughby, Charles's eldest daughter and president of the Willoughby Foundation, felt her chest tighten. She had heard whispers about her grandfather Conrad throughout her childhood, fragments of stories about his mysterious disappearance, his supposed business ventures in the West, his failure to return home as promised. But those whispers had always been dismissed as family mythology, the kind of romantic legends that every old Boston family cultivated about their frontier ancestors. Furthermore, Morrison continued, "I have established a sealed trust fund of $200,000, accessible only to family members who agree to continue certain practices that my father established and that I have maintained throughout my tenure as head of this family. These practices ensure that the truth regarding our family's origins remains protected and that those who might threaten our reputation are appropriately managed." The room fell silent. Thomas Willoughby, Charles's youngest son and a rising star in Massachusetts politics, leaned forward in his leather chair. "What exactly does he mean by appropriately managed?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he turned to the next page of the will. He had been practicing law for 30 years, had handled the most sensitive affairs of Boston's wealthiest families, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to read. "To access the trust fund," he continued, "each generation must provide evidence that they have successfully eliminated at least one threat to the family's reputation. This evidence must be submitted to the designated trustees, Who will verify that the threat has been permanently neutralized without legal consequences to the family? Elizabeth Willoughby, Charles's middle daughter, stood abruptly from her chair. As a graduate of Radcliffe and an active member of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association, she had always prided herself on her progressive values and moral clarity. "Are you suggesting," she said, her voice rising, "that our father is instructing us to commit murder?" Morrison looked up from the document, his face pale. "I am merely reading what has been written, Miss Willoughby. However, the will continues with specific instructions for how such tasks should be carried out, and provides detailed accounts of how previous generations have fulfilled these requirements." The implications began to sink in. The Willoughby family's legendary ability to silence critics, to make scandals disappear, to ensure that business rivals mysteriously withdrew from competitions, hadn't been due to superior legal representation or strategic public relations. It had been accomplished through systematic elimination of anyone who posed a threat to their interests. William Willoughby, Charles's eldest son and heir to the family business empire, felt his stomach turn as Morrison opened a leather-bound ledger that had been sealed alongside the will. "This ledger," Morrison explained, "contains records dating back to 1884. It documents the name, background, and method of elimination for 47 individuals who were deemed threats to the Willoughby family between 1884 and 1923. The first entry, written in elegant script, read, November 12, 1884, Rebecca Morrison, journalist, Boston Herald, investigating grandfather's Western activities. Method, staged carriage accident on Marlborough Street. Witnesses, none. Cost, $400 in bribes to police and coroner. Status, closed without investigation. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair, fighting waves of nausea. "This can't be real," she whispered. "Father was a philanthropist. He funded hospitals, schools, orphanages." "Yes," Morrison replied, continuing to read from the ledger. "And according to these records, he also arranged for the deaths of 2 newspaper editors, a federal investigator, and a Harvard professor who were asking inconvenient questions about those philanthropic donations. The entries suggest that many of the family's charitable activities were designed to provide cover for their other operations." Thomas stood and walked to the tall windows overlooking Beacon Hill, his mind racing. He had been planning a run for governor in 1924, built on a platform of government reform and corporate accountability. His entire political career had been funded by what he now realized was blood money, and his family's reputation for civic virtue was apparently a carefully constructed lie. "There's more," Morrison said, his voice growing weaker with each revelation. "The ledger indicates that Conrad Willoughby, your grandfather, established a network of associates across the country who provided similar services to other wealthy families. The Willoughby family served as the Eastern headquarters for what appears to have been a nationwide conspiracy involving dozens of prominent families." Elizabeth returned to her chair, but remained perched on its edge. "What exactly did Conrad do in the West that required this level of cover-up?" Morrison turned to a section of the will marked Historical Context and began reading directly from Charles's own words. "My father, Conrad Willoughby, operated establishments in frontier towns between 1869 and 1883. These establishments served 2 purposes. Publicly, they functioned as saloons and entertainment venues. Privately, they provided services to wealthy clients from the East who traveled west to indulge certain appetites that could not be satisfied within civilized society." The lawyer paused, clearly struggling with the content. "The will indicates that these services involved young women who were recruited through false advertisements in Eastern newspapers. These women were promised respectable employment in the territories, but were instead held against their will and forced to accommodate the specific requests of clients who paid substantial sums for discretion and access." William felt his legs give way and sank back into his chair. "He's describing a prostitution ring." "More than that," Morrison replied, consulting additional documents. "According to these records, many of the women never survived their ordeal. The establishments were designed not just for exploitation, but for elimination. Clients paid extra for the assurance that their activities would never be witnessed or reported." The scope of Conrad's operation began to emerge from the documents. He had operated under multiple identities in at least 6 different frontier towns: Dodge City, Denver, Cheyenne, Deadwood, Tombstone, and Seattle. In each location, he had established a high-end saloon, recruited young women through advertisements in Eastern newspapers, and provided services to a select clientele of wealthy men who traveled west under assumed names. A detailed client list, preserved in a fireproof safe whose combination was included in the will, contained names that represented the pinnacle of American society: railroad barons, steel magnates, political leaders, and even members of President Grant's administration had paid thousands of dollars to travel west and participate in activities that Charles's will described only as the fulfillment of urges that civilized society necessarily prohibits. Margaret studied a photograph that had been included with the will, a formal portrait of Conrad Willoughby, taken around 1875. He appeared to be a distinguished gentleman in his 40s, impeccably dressed, with intelligent eyes and a slight smile. Nothing in his appearance suggested the monster described in the documents, but as she read the detailed accounts of his operations, she began to understand how he had been so successful. Conrad hadn't operated as a common criminal. He had functioned as a businessman, providing a service to a specific market. His clients weren't degenerates or outcasts, but respected members of society who possessed both the wealth to pay his prices and the connections to ensure their activities remained secret. His operations were funded by some of the most powerful men in America and protected by a network of corruption that extended from frontier sheriffs to federal marshals. The will revealed that Conrad's Western operations had generated over $300,000 between 1869 and 1883, an enormous sum that represented the foundation of the Willoughby family fortune. But more importantly, he had accumulated detailed records of his clients' activities, creating a blackmail portfolio that provided his family with leverage over America's elite for generations. "Every major business deal our family has negotiated," Charles had written in his final testament, "every political favor we have received, every investigation that has been quietly dropped, has been facilitated by our possession of information that certain powerful individuals would prefer remain private. We have not merely inherited wealth. We have inherited power over those who appear to control our society." Thomas realized with growing horror that his entire life had been built on this foundation of coercion and murder. His education at Harvard, his law degree, his political connections, his upcoming gubernatorial campaign, all of it had been funded and facilitated by a network of blackmail and violence that stretched back to his grandfather's crimes in frontier towns. But the most chilling revelation was yet to come. As Morrison continued reading through the will's appendices, he discovered that Conrad's network hadn't ended with his disappearance in 1883. The documents revealed that the system he had established had been maintained and expanded by each subsequent generation of the family. Charles's will included detailed instructions for identifying potential threats, methods for eliminating them without detection, and protocols for ensuring that law enforcement investigations were misdirected or abandoned. It provided contact information for associates in major cities across the country who could provide specialized services, and outlined financial arrangements for maintaining their loyalty and discretion. "The family has survived and prospered for 40 years," Charles had written, "not because of superior business acumen or fortunate investments, but because we have systematically eliminated anyone who posed a threat to our interests. This approach has required difficult decisions and distasteful actions, but it has ensured that each generation has inherited not just wealth, but security." Elizabeth stood again, this time moving toward the library door. "I can't be part of this," she said firmly. "Whatever grandfather did, whatever father did, it ends here. I'm not going to continue this insanity." But as she reached for the door handle, Morrison called out to her, "Miss Willoughby, there's one more thing you need to understand before you make that decision." He opened another sealed envelope that had been attached to the will. "Your father has provided specific instructions for what happens if any family member refuses to participate in maintaining these traditions." The letter, written in Charles's own handwriting, contained a threat that made Elizabeth's blood run cold. "Any family member who attempts to expose or abandon our family's obligations will be treated as any other threat to our security. The network that has protected us for 4 decades will be turned against them. Their death will be made to appear accidental, and their personal effects will be searched to ensure that no evidence of our activities survives." Margaret looked around the room at her siblings, seeing her own fear reflected in their faces. They weren't just learning about their family's dark history. They were being conscripted into continuing it. The inheritance wasn't just money and property. It was a legacy of violence that would claim them as victims if they refused to become perpetrators. William opened the leather-bound ledger and read through more of the entries, each one documenting a life ended to protect the Willoughby family's interests. The victims included journalists, investigators, business rivals, and even family members who had threatened to expose the truth. The methods varied: staged accidents, sudden illnesses, mysterious disappearances, but the result was always the same. Threats to the family were eliminated, and life continued as if they had never existed. Thomas returned to his chair and picked up one of the photographs included with the will. It showed Conrad Willoughby standing outside what appeared to be an elegant frontier saloon, surrounded by several young women in period dress. They were all beautiful, all smiling, and according to the notation on the back of the photograph, all were dead within 6 months of the picture being taken. "How many?" Margaret asked quietly. "How many people has our family killed?" Morrison consulted the ledger and several other documents. According to these records, Conrad's operations directly resulted in the deaths of at least 63 young women between 1869 and 1883. Subsequent generations have eliminated 47 additional threats between 1884 and 1923. That's 110 documented murders spanning 54 years. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. 110 people had died to build and protect the Willoughby family empire. Their blood money had funded libraries and hospitals, political campaigns, and charitable foundations. The family's reputation for civic virtue had been purchased with a century of systematic murder. Elizabeth looked at the trust fund documents, trying to calculate how much money was involved. The sealed account contained $200,000, but that was just the immediate incentive. The will also outlined the family's total assets: real estate worth over $2 million, business investments valued at $5 million, and liquid assets of $3 million. The total Willoughby fortune exceeded $10 million in 1923 dollars, making them one of the wealthiest families in New England. But the money came with strings attached. To access any significant portion of the inheritance, family members had to demonstrate their commitment to maintaining the family's traditions. They had to prove their willingness to eliminate threats, and they had to do so within 1 year of Charles's death. William studied the client list that Conrad had compiled during his Western operations, recognizing names that had become synonymous with American industrial success: railroad magnate Collis Huntington, steel baron Andrew Carnegie, financier J.P. Morgan. All had apparently paid for Conrad's services, and were therefore subject to the family's ongoing blackmail schemes. "This explains everything," William said slowly. "Every impossible business deal, every federal contract we've secured, every investigation that mysteriously disappeared. We haven't been successful. We've been extorting success from people who couldn't afford to refuse us." Thomas picked up another document from the will, a detailed plan for his upcoming gubernatorial campaign that included specific strategies for eliminating potential opponents. The plan wasn't focused on superior policies or better fundraising. It outlined methods for destroying rival candidates through scandal, blackmail, and, if necessary, arranged accidents. "Father expected me to become governor through murder," Thomas said, his voice barely audible. He had already selected which opponents needed to be eliminated and how their deaths should be staged. Margaret found herself holding a letter addressed specifically to her, outlining expectations for her role in maintaining the family's operations. As president of the Willoughby Foundation, she was expected to use her charitable work as cover for identifying and accessing new targets. The letter included detailed instructions for how orphanages and women's shelters could be used to recruit vulnerable individuals for elimination. "He wanted me to turn our charitable foundation into a hunting ground," Margaret whispered. "All those women we've helped, all those children we've supported, he saw them as potential victims." Elizabeth opened her personal letter and discovered an even more disturbing assignment. Her involvement in the women's suffrage movement had apparently been cultivated specifically to give her access to reform-minded individuals who might investigate or expose powerful families. Her political activism hadn't been authentic. It had been a family assignment designed to help her identify threats before they became dangerous. The scope of the deception was overwhelming. Nothing in their lives had been authentic. Their education, careers, relationships, and even their political beliefs had been shaped by the family's criminal objectives. They weren't individuals who had inherited a dark legacy. They were products manufactured by that legacy to serve its continuing needs. Morrison looked at the four siblings, seeing the weight of realization crushing their spirits. "There's one final element," he said softly. "Your father has provided each of you with a specific first assignment. These assignments are designed to demonstrate your commitment and to provide you with the skills necessary for maintaining the family's operations." He handed each sibling a sealed envelope containing their individual instructions. The envelopes were thick, suggesting detailed plans rather than simple directives. As they opened them simultaneously, the true horror of their situation became clear. Margaret's assignment involved eliminating a journalist from the Boston Globe who had been investigating charitable foundations for financial irregularities. The plan included detailed surveillance reports, photographs of the target's daily routine, and several options for staging her death to appear accidental. William's assignment targeted a federal investigator who had been asking questions about the family's business dealings with government contractors. The plan outlined how to arrange a train accident during the investigator's upcoming trip to Washington, complete with bribed railroad employees and falsified safety reports. Thomas's assignment involved eliminating a political reformer who was planning to run against him for governor. The plan suggested poisoning the rival candidate during a public dinner, using a toxin that would mimic a heart attack and leave no trace in a standard autopsy. Elizabeth's assignment was perhaps the most personal. She was instructed to eliminate her own closest friend, a fellow suffragette who had expressed suspicions about the Willoughby family's rapid acquisition of political influence. The plan suggested staging a robbery gone wrong in Elizabeth's own home, allowing her to appear as a victim while ensuring her friend's permanent silence. As the siblings absorbed the reality of their first assignments, they realized that their father hadn't just left them a fortune. He had designed a test that would either transform them into monsters or result in their own deaths. There was no middle ground, no option to walk away, no possibility of living normal lives. The Willoughby family legacy wasn't just built on violence, it was a machine that consumed its own members, forcing each generation to choose between becoming killers or becoming victims. And as October shadows lengthened across Beacon Hill, 4 of Boston's most privileged citizens discovered that privilege had a price that could only be paid in blood. The meeting in the library that day lasted until well past midnight, as Morrison read through document after document detailing the family's activities across 5 decades. By the time they finally left that mahogany-paneled room, the Willoughby siblings understood that their lives as they had known them were over. They could either embrace their family's legacy of murder and enjoy the wealth and power it provided, or they could resist and face elimination by the same network that had protected them their entire lives. The choice was theirs, but the consequences would be permanent, and the deadline for their decision was rapidly approaching. Outside on Beacon Hill, Boston slept peacefully, unaware that one of its most respected families had just discovered they were the inheritors of America's longest-running criminal enterprise. The Willoughby mansion stood as it always had, elegant and imposing, giving no hint of the darkness contained within its walls. But inside that mansion, 4 people sat in stunned silence, contemplating murder assignments that would either initiate them into their family's true business or mark them for death. The legacy of Conrad Willoughby, the man who had built a fortune on the corpses of frontier women, was about to claim a new generation of victims. The only question remaining was whether those victims would be the Willoughby siblings themselves or the innocent people whose names appeared on their assassination lists. 3 days after that horrific meeting in their father's library, the Willoughby siblings made a decision that would prove to be their first mistake. They decided to investigate. William, with his legal background, convinced the others that they needed to understand the full scope of their inheritance before making any irreversible choices. Margaret, drawing on her experience with charitable investigations, suggested they could quietly research their grandfather Conrad's activities without arousing suspicion. Thomas believed his political connections might provide access to government records. Elizabeth, despite her horror at the family legacy, felt compelled to uncover the truth about the women's suffrage colleagues she now suspected had been targeted. What they didn't realize was that their father's network had been watching them since the moment they left Morrison's office. The same system that had protected the family for 4 decades was now evaluating whether the newest generation would prove to be assets or threats. And in the world Conrad Willoughby had created, threats had a very short life expectancy. The first sign that they were being monitored came on October 18th, when Margaret visited the Boston Public Library to research newspaper archives from the 1870s. She had hoped to find contemporary accounts of the frontier towns where her grandfather had operated, perhaps uncovering evidence that might help her understand the true scope of his crimes. But as she settled into a quiet corner of the research room with microfilm reels from Kansas and Colorado newspapers, she noticed a well-dressed man at a nearby table who seemed unusually interested in her work. The man appeared to be reading a book about American industrial history, but Margaret caught him glancing at her research materials and taking notes that seemed unrelated to his supposed topic. When she moved to a different table to test her suspicions, he casually relocated as well, maintaining the same distance while appearing to focus on his own work. After 2 hours of this surveillance, Margaret gathered her materials and left the library, but not before she noticed the man speaking quietly to the librarian who had assisted her with the microfilm archives. That evening, Margaret called William to report the incident, but their conversation was interrupted by strange clicking sounds on the telephone line. Both siblings had grown up in a world where telephone service was often imperfect, but these sounds were different, rhythmic, deliberate, like someone connecting and disconnecting monitoring equipment. They ended the call quickly and agreed to meet in person the following day. Meanwhile, Thomas had been using his political connections to access federal records related to his grandfather's disappearance in 1883. A friend in the Treasury Department had promised to check immigration records and federal investigation files for any mention of Conrad Willoughby. But when Thomas arrived at their scheduled meeting on October 19th, his friend appeared nervous and evasive. "I couldn't find anything," the Treasury official said, avoiding eye contact. "No records of a Conrad Willoughby in any federal files. It's like he never existed." Thomas pressed for more details, but his friend became increasingly uncomfortable. "Look, Tom, someone higher up asked why I was searching for those records. I told them it was for a friend doing genealogical research, but they seemed very interested in who was asking. Maybe you should drop this. Some family histories are better left buried." The warning was clear, but it also confirmed what Thomas had begun to suspect. The network his father had described wasn't just a collection of hired criminals. It included people in positions of authority who could manipulate official records, suppress investigations, and monitor anyone who asked inconvenient questions. Elizabeth's investigation took a different approach. She decided to research the women's suffrage colleagues whom her father's records had identified as threats. Using her connections in the movement, she began making discreet inquiries about several activists who had died in suspicious circumstances over the past decade. What she discovered made her realize that the family's activities hadn't been limited to strangers. They had been systematically targeting people within Elizabeth's own social circle. Sarah Mitchell, a suffrage organizer who had died in a carriage accident in 1919, had been investigating connections between women's charitable organizations and political corruption. Her death occurred just 2 weeks after she had requested a meeting with Elizabeth to discuss disturbing financial patterns she had discovered. The police report on the accident noted that the carriage driver had fled the scene and was never identified, but the investigation was closed within days due to lack of evidence. Rebecca Thompson, a journalist who had covered women's political activities for the Boston Herald, had died of sudden illness in 1921 after writing articles about the unusual influence certain charitable foundations wielded over government officials. Her final article, which was never published, had been titled "The Hidden Powers Behind Boston's Philanthropic Elite." Her editor told Elizabeth that the article had been lost during a break-in at the newspaper's offices the night after Rebecca's death. Most disturbing was the case of Helen Morris, Elizabeth's own former roommate at Radcliffe, who had died in what was ruled a suicide in 1920. Helen had been researching the genealogies of prominent New England families for her master's thesis in history. Her thesis advisor told Elizabeth that Helen had been particularly interested in families whose wealth seemed to have appeared suddenly in the 1880s, and that she had been asking questions about discrepancies in official records versus family oral histories. Elizabeth realized with growing horror that her own friendships, her political activities, and her social connections had been systematically exploited by her family to identify and eliminate threats. Every meeting she had attended, every conversation she had held with fellow activists, had potentially been monitored and analyzed for signs of danger to the Willoughby interests. William's legal research had led him to an equally disturbing discovery. Using his access to court records and legal archives, he had been tracing the history of civil lawsuits, criminal investigations, and regulatory actions that had been filed against Willoughby family businesses over the decades. The pattern he found was both subtle and sinister. In case after case, legal challenges to Willoughby interests would begin with proper filings, legitimate evidence, and determined prosecutors or plaintiffs. But then something would always happen. Key witnesses would recant their testimony, crucial evidence would disappear, prosecutors would suddenly be reassigned to other cases, or opposing attorneys would withdraw from representation. In more than a dozen instances, the individuals bringing challenges against the family had died in accidents or from sudden illnesses before their cases could proceed to trial. But William also discovered something else. The same pattern existed for other prominent Boston families. The Carletons, the Ashfords, the Blackwoods, and at least 6 other wealthy New England dynasties showed identical patterns of legal challenges that mysteriously evaporated. Either Boston was experiencing an epidemic of coincidental accidents affecting people who sued wealthy families, or there was a systematic conspiracy involving multiple elite families working together to eliminate threats. The siblings arranged to meet on October 21st at Margaret's home on Commonwealth Avenue, believing that a private residence would be safer than a public location. But as they gathered in Margaret's drawing room that evening, each carrying evidence of their individual discoveries, they failed to notice the subtle signs that they were walking into a trap. Margaret's household staff, whom she had employed for over 5 years, had been behaving differently since her father's death. Her butler, Peters, who normally maintained perfect composure, seemed nervous and distracted. Her cook, Mrs. Harrison, had been asking unusual questions about Margaret's schedule and visitors. Most telling, her personal secretary, Miss Caldwell, had been staying late each evening, supposedly organizing Margaret's correspondence, but actually searching through her personal papers and notes. As the 4 siblings compared their research findings, they began to understand the true scope of their family's criminal enterprise. Conrad Willoughby hadn't been an individual criminal operating in frontier towns. He had been the Western agent for a network of wealthy Eastern families who had pooled their resources to create a nationwide system for eliminating threats to their interests. The client list found in Charles's will represented not just Conrad's customers, but his partners, the railroad barons, steel magnates, and political leaders who had paid for his services, had also contributed to building and maintaining the network. Over the decades, this conspiracy had evolved into a shadow organization that included wealthy families, corrupt officials, hired criminals, and embedded agents within law enforcement, government, and the media. "We're not just inheriting father's crimes," William said as he studied the documents they had assembled. "We're being inducted into a criminal organization that controls significant portions of American society." Thomas had brought a map on which he had marked the locations of suspicious deaths connected to various wealthy families. The pattern showed clusters of eliminated threats in every major American city, with highest concentrations around centers of political and economic power. "This isn't just about our family," he said, pointing to the map. This network extends to Washington, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco. We're looking at a conspiracy that involves hundreds of powerful families across the entire country." Margaret had discovered something even more disturbing in her research into charitable organizations. Many of the foundations and orphanages funded by elite families were being used not just for money laundering and cover operations, but as recruitment centers for victims. Vulnerable young women, particularly those without families or social connections, were being systematically identified and provided to clients who paid for the privilege of hunting human prey. "The charitable work isn't just a cover," Margaret explained, her voice shaking as she shared her findings. "It's the supply chain. They're using orphanages, women's shelters, and immigrant aid societies to identify isolated individuals who won't be missed when they disappear." Elizabeth had brought the most personally devastating evidence. Her research into the suffrage movement had revealed that it had been infiltrated and monitored from its earliest days. Women who posed political threats weren't just being eliminated, they were being recruited as unwitting informants against their own colleagues. Elizabeth realized that her own political activities might have contributed to the deaths of women she had considered friends and allies. As they sat in Margaret's drawing room, surrounded by evidence of their family's crimes and the larger conspiracy they were inheriting. The siblings faced a moment of terrible clarity. They weren't just being asked to continue their father's work, they were being tested to see if they were suitable for induction into America's most powerful criminal organization. But their moment of revelation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the drawing room. Peters and the butler knocked quietly on the door and entered without waiting for permission, a breach of protocol so unusual that all four siblings immediately knew something was wrong. "Oh, excuse me, Miss Willoughby," Peters said, his voice strained and his hands visibly trembling. "There are gentlemen here to see you and your family. They say it's urgent business related to your father's estate." Margaret looked at her siblings, seeing her own fear reflected in their faces. "Did they give their names?" "No, miss. They simply said that Mr. Morrison had sent them to discuss certain family obligations that require immediate attention." William stood slowly, recognizing the coded language from their father's will. Morrison had been instructed to send representatives if the family failed to demonstrate their commitment to the network within 1 week of learning about their inheritance. That deadline was tomorrow. "How many gentlemen?" Thomas asked, moving toward the window to look out at the street. "4, sir. They're waiting in the front parlor. They've brought a carriage, and there are additional men posted outside." Elizabeth realized that they were no longer free to leave. The network that had protected them their entire lives had determined that they might be threats, and was now treating them accordingly. The evidence they had gathered, the questions they had asked, the meetings they had held, all of it had been monitored and reported to individuals who were now prepared to take action. "Tell them we'll be down shortly," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. After Peters left, the siblings looked at each other with the knowledge that their lives as they had known them were ending. They could comply with the network's demands and become active participants in a criminal conspiracy that spanned generations and continents. Or they could resist and face elimination by the same forces that had eliminated hundreds of others who had posed threats to the organization. Thomas moved to the window and confirmed what he had feared. Men were positioned at both ends of the street, and additional figures were visible in the shadows of nearby buildings. "We're surrounded," he said quietly. "Whatever we decide, we're not leaving here unless they allow it." William gathered the documents they had assembled during their investigation. "They're going to want to know what we've discovered and who we've shared it with. Our answers will determine whether we live through the night." Margaret thought about the household staff who had served her family faithfully for years, now realizing that their loyalty had always been to the network rather than to the family. "Even our own servants have been reporting on us. We've never had privacy, never had independence. Our entire lives have been managed and monitored." Elizabeth picked up her assignment letter, the one instructing her to kill her friend Sarah. "If we agree to this, we're not just continuing Father's work. We're surrendering our souls to an organization that has been manipulating us since birth." As they prepared to go downstairs and meet with the network's representatives, each sibling understood that they were facing the most consequential decision of their lives. But they also understood that the decision might already have been made for them by the organization that viewed them not as inheritors, but as potential threats to be either controlled or eliminated. The drawing room where they had spent the evening discovering the truth about their family would be the last place they existed as the people they had believed themselves to be. When they left that room, they would either become active participants in America's most powerful criminal conspiracy, or they would become its next victims. Outside on Commonwealth Avenue, the men waiting in the shadows had protocols for either outcome. The organization Conrad Willoughby had helped create never left loose ends, and after 40 years of operation, it had developed efficient methods for handling family members who proved unsuitable for the family business. The Willoughby siblings walked toward the staircase that would take them to their fate, carrying the weight of evidence that documented crimes spanning 5 decades and 4 generations. But they also carried something else: the knowledge that they were not the first generation to face this choice, and they would not be the last. Somewhere in Boston, in New York, in Philadelphia, and in cities across America, other wealthy families were conducting similar meetings, making similar choices, and perpetuating a system of power that had been built on the corpses of those who had dared to threaten it. The network Conrad Willoughby had helped establish had grown beyond anything he could have imagined, becoming a shadow government that operated parallel to official institutions and often superseded them in terms of real power. The question facing the Willoughby siblings as they descended the stairs toward their waiting interrogators was not just whether they would choose to kill to preserve their inheritance. It was whether they would choose to become part of a system that treated human life as a commodity to be traded, a threat to be eliminated, or a resource to be exploited. In the front parlor, 4 men in expensive suits waited with the patience of professionals who had conducted this type of recruitment interview many times before. They carried briefcases containing detailed dossiers on each sibling, psychological profiles that had been compiled over years of surveillance, and contingency plans for every possible outcome of the evening's conversation. The network had survived and thrived for 4 decades because it never relied on individual loyalty or family sentiment. It survived because it offered its members benefits they could obtain nowhere else, and because it eliminated anyone who posed a threat to its continued operation. The Willoughby siblings were about to learn whether they would be welcomed as new members or eliminated as security risks. Either way, the network would continue its operations, recruiting new families, eliminating new threats, and maintaining the shadow power structure that allowed America's wealthiest dynasties to operate above the law and beyond the reach of conventional justice. The choice facing the Willoughbys was not really about their individual moral positions or personal preferences. It was about whether they understood the reality of power in American society and were prepared to pay the price required to wield it. That price, as their grandfather Conrad had established in the frontier towns of the 1870s, was always measured in blood. As Margaret reached for the door handle that would open onto the front parlor, she realized that whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of countless future victims who would either be targeted by the network or protected from it, depending on the choice she and her siblings were about to make. The door opened, and the next phase of the Willoughby family legacy began. Escalar atenção. As consequências das investigações. The 4 men waiting in Margaret's front parlor were not what the siblings had expected. Instead of the crude criminals they had imagined, they found themselves facing individuals who could have been attending a Harvard faculty meeting or a Wall Street board conference. Their leader, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, rose from his chair with the courteous manner of a family friend offering condolences. "Miss Willoughby, gentlemen," he said with a slight bow, "please accept our sympathies for your father's passing. Charles was a valued colleague and will be greatly missed. I am Dr. Harrison Blackwood, and I represent certain associates who worked closely with your father over the years." The name Blackwood was familiar to all of them. The Blackwood family was one of Boston's oldest and most respected dynasties, with connections to shipping, banking, and philanthropy that stretched back to the colonial era. Dr. Blackwood himself was known as a prominent physician and medical researcher, whose charitable work with children's hospitals had earned him recognition throughout New England. "We understand," Dr. Blackwood continued, "that Attorney Morrison has shared with you certain family documents and historical information that may have come as something of a shock. We're here to provide context and guidance as you consider your response to the opportunities your father has made available to you." William stepped forward, drawing on his legal training to maintain composure in what was clearly a negotiation with life or death stakes. "Dr. Blackwood, we appreciate your concern for our family, but we're not entirely clear on what opportunities you're referring to." The doctor smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. "Please, let's not waste time with pretense. Your father's will was quite explicit about the nature of your inheritance and the expectations that accompany it. We're here because certain aspects of your behavior since receiving this information have raised questions about your commitment to maintaining family traditions." Thomas felt his stomach drop as he realized the full extent of their surveillance. "You've been watching us?" "Of course," Dr. Blackwood replied matter-of-factly. "Just as we've been watching and protecting your family for decades. The network your grandfather helped establish doesn't function through trust or goodwill, Mr. Willoughby. It functions through comprehensive monitoring, careful evaluation, and decisive action when necessary." Margaret moved to a chair but remained standing, using the physical positioning to assert some control over the situation. "What exactly do you want from us, Doctor?" Blackwood opened his briefcase and removed 4 manila folders, each labeled with one of their names. "We want what your father wanted. Confirmation that the next generation of Willoughbys understands their responsibilities and is prepared to fulfill them." Your individual assignment letters provide specific instructions for demonstrating this commitment. He placed the folders on the coffee table with deliberate care. However, your activities since receiving these assignments have been concerning. Research visits to public libraries, attempts to access federal records, investigations into the deaths of individuals who were eliminated for threatening network interests. These behaviors suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of your situation. Elizabeth felt her carefully constructed world continuing to collapse. You're talking about murder as if it were a business transaction. Because it is, Dr. Blackwood replied without hesitation. Your family has participated in a business that provides essential services to America's most powerful individuals. Those services sometimes require the elimination of threats, but they also include protection, information, influence, and access to opportunities that would otherwise be impossible to obtain. He opened William's folder and removed a photograph. Mr. Willoughby, your assignment involves a federal investigator named Robert Harrison, no relation to myself, who has been asking questions about certain government contracts awarded to companies with Willoughby family connections. Mr. Harrison is scheduled to interview several Treasury Department officials next week regarding irregularities in the contract approval process. The photograph showed a middle-aged man with a wife and 2 young children, clearly taken during a family outing to what appeared to be a public park. William realized he was looking at surveillance documentation of the man he was expected to kill. Mr. Harrison is 42 years old. Dr. Blackwood continued in the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather. He has a wife, Ellen, and children aged 8 and 11. He's a dedicated investigator with an excellent reputation for thoroughness and integrity. These qualities make him effective in his work, but also make him a threat to interests that your family has been protecting for decades. Thomas found his voice. You're asking us to murder innocent people? Dr. Blackwood's expression didn't change. I'm asking you to continue a family business that has provided you with wealth, education, social position, and political influence that most Americans can only dream of achieving. The cost of maintaining these advantages has always been the elimination of those who threaten them. He opened Thomas's folder and showed him similar surveillance materials for his own assignment target, your political opponent, Mr. Franklin Morrison, again, no relation to your family attorney, represents exactly the kind of reformist threat that has always required management. His platform of government transparency and corporate accountability would, if implemented, severely compromise the network's ability to operate. Margaret stared at the photographs, trying to reconcile the casual discussion of murder with the civilized setting of her own parlor. How long has this been going on? How many families are involved? Dr. Blackwood consulted a leather-bound notebook he had retrieved from his briefcase. The current network includes 47 core families across the United States, with additional associate members in Canada, England, and several European countries. Combined, these families control assets worth approximately $400 million and wield influence over industries including shipping, railroads, steel, oil, banking, and government. The scope was staggering. What they had discovered about their own family was apparently just one component of a criminal organization that rivaled national governments in terms of wealth and power. The network operates through regional councils, Dr. Blackwood explained. Boston serves as the northeastern headquarters, but there are similar operations in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco, and Atlanta. Each council oversees elimination activities in its region and coordinates with other councils when targets cross jurisdictional boundaries. Elizabeth opened her own folder and found detailed surveillance reports on her friend Sarah, including photographs taken inside Elizabeth's own home during private conversations. You've been spying on me in my own house? Miss Willoughby, your household staff has been reporting to the network since you established your residence. This is standard practice for all member families. It ensures early identification of potential security threats and allows us to provide protection when necessary. William realized that their entire lives had been managed by the organization they were now being asked to join. Our education, our careers, our social connections, all of it has been arranged by the network. Naturally, Dr. Blackwood confirmed, the network invests heavily in each generation of member families. Your admission to Harvard, Mr. Willoughby, was facilitated by network influence over the admissions process. Miss Margaret's appointment to the board of the Children's Hospital, was arranged to provide her with access to vulnerable populations that might be useful for network operations. Mr. Thomas's political career has been funded and guided by network resources from its beginning. Margaret felt sick as she understood the implications. The charitable work I've devoted my life to has been used to identify victims. Among other purposes, yes. Charitable organizations provide excellent cover for monitoring and accessing individuals who might otherwise be difficult to approach. They also serve important functions in money laundering, political influence, and social control. Thomas studied the materials in his folder, recognizing the professional quality of the surveillance and the comprehensive nature of the intelligence gathered on his target. This is military-level operation planning. Many of our operational specialists have military backgrounds, Dr. Blackwood acknowledged. The network recruits heavily from former military intelligence officers, federal investigators who have become disenchanted with government limitations, and law enforcement officials who understand the benefits of private sector compensation. He gestured toward the other 3 men who had accompanied him to the meeting. My colleagues here represent various aspects of network operations. Mr. Peterson handles logistics and coordination. Mr. Walsh specializes in elimination techniques and forensic countermeasures. Mr. Foster manages information control and media relations. Each man nodded slightly as he was introduced, maintaining the same professional demeanor their leader displayed. Elizabeth realized she was looking at individuals who had probably killed dozens of people while maintaining the appearance of respectable businessmen. The assignments you've been given, Dr. Blackwood continued, are designed not just to demonstrate commitment, but to provide you with the skills and psychological conditioning necessary for network membership. Each elimination must be planned and executed personally, using techniques that leave no evidence and create no suspicion. William's legal mind focused on the practical implications. What happens if we refuse? Dr. Blackwood's smile faded slightly. Refusal would indicate that you pose an unacceptable security risk to network operations. Such risks are managed through the same methods we use for external threats. The implication was clear without being explicitly stated. The Willoughby siblings would either become killers or become victims. There was no third option. Margaret thought about the decades of surveillance, manipulation, and control that had shaped their lives. Why are you telling us all this? Why not just eliminate us if you see us as threats? Because network expansion requires recruitment of new families, and the Willoughby family has been particularly valuable over the decades. Your grandfather's initial contributions provided crucial capital and operational expertise. Your father's generation expanded network influence into new sectors and geographical regions. Your generation has the potential to advance network operations into areas like women's political movements, federal regulatory agencies, and academic institutions. Thomas understood the strategic thinking. You need us for access to influence networks that previous generations couldn't penetrate. Precisely. Miss Elizabeth's involvement in women's suffrage provides intelligence on political reform movements that could threaten network interests. Mr. Thomas's political career offers direct access to government decision-making processes. Mr. Williams' legal practice provides early warning of investigative activities that might target network operations. Dr. Blackwood closed the folders and returned them to his briefcase. The choice you face is not whether to continue your family's criminal activities. The choice is whether to acknowledge and embrace your role in a system that has been shaping your lives since birth, or to persist in the fantasy that you have been free individuals making independent decisions. Elizabeth felt the weight of realization crushing her spirit. We've never been free, have we? Every choice we've made, every relationship we've formed, every opportunity we've received, it's all been orchestrated by the network. Freedom is an illusion, Miss Willoughby. Power is reality. The network offers its members the opportunity to wield real power, rather than chase the illusion of freedom. Your assignments will provide you with your first taste of what true power feels like. Margaret looked around her parlor, seeing it now as the stage for a performance she had been unconsciously giving her entire life. What if we agree to join but refuse to kill? What if we offer other contributions to the network? Dr. Blackwood shook his head. Killing is not an unfortunate requirement of network membership, Miss Willoughby. It is the fundamental qualification. Until you have taken a life to protect network interests, you cannot be trusted with network secrets or relied upon to make necessary decisions. He stood from his chair, indicating that the interview was concluding. You have until tomorrow evening to complete your assignments and provide evidence of success. Failure to do so will result in your classification as security threats, with all that implies. As the 4 network representatives prepared to leave, Dr. Blackwood offered one final observation. Your father chose to embrace his role in the network and enjoyed 40 years of wealth, influence, and protection as a result. Your grandfather helped establish this system and died peacefully in his bed, knowing that his descendants would be provided for indefinitely. The choice you face tonight is not about morality or justice. It's about reality and survival. The front door closed behind them with a quiet click that seemed to seal the Willoughby siblings' fate. They were alone in Margaret's parlor, surrounded by evidence of their family's crimes and facing assignment deadlines that would either transform them into murderers or mark them for elimination. Outside, the network's surveillance teams remained in position, monitoring the house and ready to intervene if the siblings attempted to flee or contact outside authorities. The organization Conrad Willoughby had helped create never left outcomes to chance, and after 40 years of operation, it had developed contingency plans for every possible scenario. The Willoughby siblings had less than 24 hours to choose between their souls and their lives, and as the clock on Margaret's mantel chimed midnight, they understood that time was running out not just for them, but for the innocent people whose names appeared on their assassination lists. At 3:17 a.m. on October 22, 1923, Elizabeth Willoughby made the decision that would define the rest of her life and expose the true horror of her family's legacy. Unable to sleep after the network's ultimatum, she had been pacing her bedroom, staring at the assignment folder that contained detailed instructions for murdering her friend Sarah. But it wasn't the prospect of committing murder that finally drove her to action. It was something she discovered hidden in the depths of that folder, something the network representatives had assumed she would never find. Buried beneath the surveillance photographs and elimination protocols was a single sheet of paper that had been misfiled, apparently transferred from another assignment folder by mistake. The document was a medical examination report dated September 1923, signed by Dr. Harrison Blackwood himself. But the patient wasn't Sarah Morrison, Elizabeth's intended target. The patient was Elizabeth herself. The report detailed a comprehensive psychological evaluation, conducted without subject's knowledge, over a period of 18 months. It included analysis of Elizabeth's political activities, her personal relationships, her emotional responses to various stimuli, and most disturbingly, her suitability for advanced network operations requiring specialized psychological conditioning. Elizabeth read the document with growing horror, realizing that every conversation she had held with Dr. Blackwood's supposed medical colleagues at social events had been disguised evaluation sessions. Every charity gala, every political meeting, every casual encounter with certain individuals had been orchestrated to test her reactions and map her psychological profile. The network hadn't just been watching her, they had been systematically studying her mind to determine how best to transform her into a killer. But the most shocking revelation came in the report's conclusion. Subject displays optimal characteristics for specialized operations involving prolonged psychological manipulation of targets before elimination. Recommend assignment to Advanced Conditioning Protocol 7, which has proven effective in previous cases involving family members who initially displayed moral resistance to network operations. Elizabeth realized that her assignment wasn't just about killing Sarah. It was about breaking down her own psychological barriers through a carefully designed process of escalating violence. The network had identified her moral objections to murder as an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a disqualifying characteristic. More terrifying still, the report referenced previous cases involving other family members who had undergone similar conditioning. Elizabeth wasn't the first Willoughby to resist the family legacy, and she wasn't the first to be subjected to psychological manipulation designed to transform resistance into compliance. Unable to remain in her bedroom with this knowledge, Elizabeth crept through her house to the study where she kept her personal correspondence and political files. If the network had been monitoring her for 18 months, she needed to understand the full extent of their surveillance and manipulation. What she discovered in her own files made her understand that her entire adult life had been a carefully constructed experiment. Every friendship she had formed, every political cause she had embraced, every romantic relationship she had pursued had been influenced or directly arranged by network operatives. Her involvement in the women's suffrage movement hadn't been the result of personal conviction. It had been cultivated by network agents who needed an asset within the reform movement. Her closest friendships had been established with women who were themselves either network assets or designated targets for future elimination. Most devastating of all, Elizabeth found evidence that her beloved former roommate Helen Morris, whose death had been ruled a suicide in 1920, had actually been killed as part of Elizabeth's own psychological conditioning. Helen's death had been designed to traumatize Elizabeth in specific ways that would make her more susceptible to the network's influence and more likely to comply with their demands when the time came. The network hadn't just killed Helen. They had used her murder as a tool to shape Elizabeth's psychological development, studying how grief and trauma affected her decision-making processes and her willingness to challenge authority. Helen had died not because she posed a threat to the network, but because her death would be useful in preparing Elizabeth for eventual recruitment. Elizabeth collapsed into her desk chair as the full scope of the network's psychological manipulation became clear. She wasn't being asked to join a criminal organization. She was being harvested as the product of a decades-long experiment in manufacturing human monsters. Every emotion she had felt, every moral position she had taken, every relationship she had valued had been observed, analyzed, and used to design more effective methods of breaking down her resistance to murder. At 4:30 a.m., Elizabeth made the decision that would change everything. Instead of following her assignment instructions or attempting to flee, she began documenting everything she had discovered. Using her knowledge of the suffrage movement's communication networks, she started preparing a comprehensive exposure of the conspiracy that would be distributed to newspapers, government officials, and reform organizations across the country. But as Elizabeth worked frantically to compile evidence and prepare her exposé, she was unaware that her decision had already been anticipated by the network's psychological specialists. Dr. Blackwood's evaluation report had predicted that she would attempt exactly this form of resistance, and contingency plans had been prepared for managing what the network termed document-based rebellion syndrome. At 5:15 a.m., Margaret Willoughby was awakened by a telephone call from her butler at Petersdar, who was calling from the police station. His voice was strained and frightened as he explained that he had been arrested for theft after stolen jewelry was discovered in his personal quarters. The jewelry, he insisted, had been planted by unknown individuals who had broken into the house during the night. Margaret realized immediately that the arrest was connected to the network's ultimatum. Peters had been her most trusted employee for 5 years, and his sudden legal troubles were clearly designed to remove him from the house and replace him with network operatives who could monitor her activities more closely. But when Margaret arrived at the police station to post Peters' bail, she discovered that the charges had been dropped due to insufficient evidence. Peters was being released immediately, but with the understanding that he would be subject to arrest again if he returned to Margaret's employment. The message was clear. The network could manipulate the legal system as easily as they manipulated everything else. As Margaret left the police station, she noticed that Peters was being approached by 2 well-dressed men who escorted him to a waiting carriage. She realized that her former butler was being recruited as a network asset, probably offered a substantial payment to report on Margaret's activities and provide access to her home when necessary. Margaret returned to Commonwealth Avenue to find that her house had been burglarized during her absence. Nothing of monetary value had been taken, but her personal papers had been searched, her correspondence had been photographed, and listening devices had been installed in her telephone and several rooms. The burglary had been conducted with surgical precision, leaving no evidence of forced entry and no indication of amateur criminal activity. Meanwhile, Thomas Willoughby was discovering that his political career was unraveling with suspicious speed. His campaign manager called at 6 Monday a.m. to inform him that 3 major donors had withdrawn their support overnight, citing concerns about Thomas's family background and potential conflicts of interest. His campaign offices had been vandalized, destroying voter registration files and donation records. Most damaging, an anonymous letter had been delivered to several newspapers containing allegations about the Willoughby family's questionable business practices and Thomas's unfitness for public office. The letter didn't contain any specific accusations that could be proven or disproven, but it raised enough questions to make Thomas's gubernatorial candidacy untenable. Within hours, Editorial writers were calling for Thomas to withdraw from the race to avoid bringing scandal to Massachusetts politics. Thomas realized that the network was demonstrating their ability to destroy his life's work in a matter of hours. Everything he had achieved, every relationship he had built, every goal he had pursued could be eliminated as easily as the network eliminated human targets. His political career had been their creation, and they could uncreate it whenever they chose. William Willoughby's legal practice faced a different but equally devastating assault. At 7 a.m., he arrived at his office to find federal marshals waiting with a search warrant, authorizing them to seize all client files related to potential violations of federal banking regulations. William's most important clients were abandoning him based on anonymous tips, suggesting that his legal advice had involved fraudulent activities. More seriously, William discovered that several of his recent legal briefs contained what appeared to be deliberate errors that could result in sanctions from the State Bar Association. When he examined the documents more carefully, he realized that the errors had been introduced after he had filed the original versions. Someone with access to court records had been altering his work to make it appear that he was incompetent or corrupt. The network was systematically destroying the professional reputation that William had spent 15 years building. By the end of the day, he would be facing potential disbarment, federal investigation, and bankruptcy. Everything he had worked for was being dismantled with the same methodical precision the network applied to eliminating human targets. But the most devastating assault was being directed at Elizabeth. As she worked to compile her exposé of the network's crimes, she began receiving telephone calls from women she had considered close friends and political allies. One by one, they informed her that they could no longer associate with her due to concerns about her family's reputation and questions about her true motivations in joining the suffrage movement. Elizabeth realized that the network was activating a comprehensive social isolation campaign designed to discredit her before she could share her evidence with anyone who might believe her. Her friends weren't abandoning her because of new information. They were being pressured by network operatives who had been embedded within the suffrage movement for years. By 10 a.m., the 4 Willoughby siblings had lost their staff, their careers, their reputations, and their social connections. The network had demonstrated that they could destroy everything the family valued in a matter of hours. The ultimatum wasn't really about choosing between murder and death. It was about understanding that the network already controlled every aspect of their lives. But Elizabeth's research during the early morning hours had revealed something that Dr. Blackwood and his colleagues hadn't anticipated. Hidden in her correspondence files were letters from other families who had faced similar ultimatums in previous years. The network's psychological conditioning program wasn't perfect, and some family members had found ways to resist or escape. A letter dated 1919 from someone calling herself a former prisoner contained detailed information about network operations and methods for avoiding their surveillance. The letter had been delivered to Elizabeth through a complex chain of suffrage movement contacts, suggesting that there was a hidden resistance network operating within the broader criminal organization. The network's power depends on isolation and deception, the letter explained. They convince each family that they are alone, that resistance is impossible, that compliance is the only option for survival. But they are not as omnipotent as they pretend. Their surveillance systems have gaps, their psychological manipulation has limits, and their political protection has boundaries. The letter provided specific instructions for contacting other families who had successfully resisted network recruitment, and it included evidence that could be used to expose network operations to federal authorities who were not compromised by the conspiracy. Most importantly, the letter revealed that the network's deadlines were psychological pressure tactics rather than absolute requirements. They will threaten immediate death for non-compliance, the letter warned, but they actually prefer gradual conversion to outright elimination. Dead family members cannot provide ongoing services, and killing entire families attracts unwanted attention. Their goal is compliance, not elimination. Elizabeth realized that the network's ultimatum was designed to force a decision before the family could discover alternatives. By creating artificial time pressure and demonstrating their power to destroy careers and reputations, they were trying to make murder seem like the only option for preserving any quality of life. At 11 a.m., Elizabeth contacted her siblings and arranged a meeting at a location specified in the resistance letter, a small chapel in Cambridge that was supposedly outside the network's immediate surveillance zone. When the four siblings gathered in the empty chapel, they shared what they had discovered during the night and early morning. "We're not facing a simple choice between murder and death," Elizabeth explained, showing them the resistance letter and the documentation she had compiled. "We're being manipulated by a psychological warfare campaign designed to make us believe we have no alternatives." William studied the legal documents Elizabeth had collected, recognizing evidence of federal crimes that could potentially bring down the entire network if presented to the right authorities. There are federal prosecutors who specialize in organized crime cases. If we can identify officials who aren't compromised by network influence, we might be able to expose this conspiracy. Margaret had brought her own discovery: financial records showing how charitable organizations were being used to launder money and identify victims. The network's operations involve federal tax fraud, wire fraud, and violations of numerous banking regulations. This isn't just murder. It's a comprehensive criminal enterprise that could be prosecuted under federal racketeering statutes. Thomas had used his political contacts to identify government officials who might be willing to investigate network activities. There are federal agents who have been asking questions about organized crime connections to political corruption. If we can provide them with evidence, we might be able to trigger a federal investigation. But even as they planned their resistance, the siblings understood the enormous risks they were taking. The network had demonstrated its ability to infiltrate government agencies, manipulate law enforcement, and eliminate threats with impunity. Attempting to expose the conspiracy could result in their deaths, but it might also be their only hope for escaping the legacy of violence that had consumed their family for generations. Elizabeth opened the folder containing her assignment materials one more time, looking at the photographs of Sarah Morrison and the detailed plans for her murder. If we're going to do this, we need to understand that there's no going back. Once we try to expose the network, we'll be marked for elimination regardless of whether we succeed. William nodded grimly. But if we comply with their demands and commit murder, we'll be marked for life as network assets. We'll never be free, and we'll never be safe. Every year, they'll demand more violent acts to prove our continued loyalty. Margaret thought about the decades of deception and manipulation that had shaped their lives. We've never really been free anyway. At least this way, we have a chance to prevent future victims and maybe save other families from facing the same choice we're facing. Thomas considered the political implications of exposing a conspiracy that included some of America's most powerful families. If we succeed, we'll be destroying a system that has shaped American politics and business for decades. The consequences will reach far beyond our own family. Elizabeth closed the assignment folder and placed it on the chapel altar. "That's exactly why we have to do this. This system has been killing innocent people for 50 years, and it's been using families like ours to do the killing. If we don't stop it, who will?" As the siblings prepared to leave the chapel and begin their campaign to expose the network, they understood that they were crossing a point of no return. They would either succeed in bringing down one of America's most powerful criminal organizations, or they would become its latest victims. But they also understood something else. For the first time in their lives, they were making a choice based on their own moral convictions rather than network manipulation. Whether they lived or died, they would finally be acting as free individuals rather than as products of a system designed to manufacture human monsters. The network had spent decades shaping them into perfect assets, but their psychological conditioning had failed to achieve its ultimate goal. Instead of creating compliant killers, it had created witnesses who were willing to risk everything to expose the truth. Dr. Blackwood and his colleagues had made a critical error in their psychological assessment. They had underestimated the power of moral conviction to overcome even the most sophisticated manipulation. The Willoughby siblings were about to discover whether their decision to choose conscience over survival would result in victory or martyrdom. Intensificação do conflito, a batalha final. Começa by 2 p.m. on October 22nd, Dr. Harrison Blackwood realized that the Willoughby siblings had made an unexpected choice. Network surveillance teams reported that all 4 family members had failed to begin executing their assignments and had instead spent the morning gathering in unauthorized locations and collecting documentation. Their behavior indicated that they were preparing for resistance rather than compliance. From his office in the Blackwood Mansion on Beacon Hill, Dr. Blackwood initiated Protocol 7, the network's contingency plan for managing complete family rebellion. This protocol had been used only 3 times in the network's 40-year history, and it had never failed to resolve resistance within 24 hours. Protocol 7 involved activating every network asset in the Boston area and directing them to focus on a single family until compliance was achieved or elimination was completed. Within hours, the Willoughby siblings would face pressure from every direction: legal, financial, social, and physical, until they either surrendered or were destroyed. At 2:30 p.m., federal marshals arrived at Williams' law office with an expanded search warrant authorizing them to investigate potential treason charges related to his family's historical connections to certain foreign interests. The marshals informed William that he was being placed under federal surveillance pending a full investigation of the Willoughby family's activities during and after the Civil War. The charges were absurd. Conrad Willoughby's frontier activities had no connection to foreign espionage, but they provided legal cover for indefinite detention and comprehensive surveillance. William realized that the network had federal prosecutors and judges among its assets, and they were using the legal system as a weapon against his family. Simultaneously, Margaret discovered that her charitable foundation was being audited by both the Internal Revenue Service and the Massachusetts Department of Revenue. Her personal bank accounts had been frozen pending investigation of potential tax fraud, and her property on Commonwealth Avenue had been seized as evidence of financial crimes. Margaret understood that the network was using government agencies to destroy her financial independence and force her into a position where she would need their protection to survive. Without access to her own money or property, she would be completely dependent on network assistance for basic necessities. Thomas received a visit from 2 federal investigators who informed him that his political campaign was being investigated for potential violations of election law and corruption statutes. His campaign funds had been frozen. His political associates were being questioned about potential criminal activities, and his name was being circulated among Massachusetts newspapers as the subject of a federal corruption investigation. The investigators made it clear that cooperation with their investigation, which they described as an inquiry into organized crime influences in Massachusetts politics, could result in more favorable treatment. Thomas realized that the network was offering him a choice between becoming an informant against his own family or facing federal prosecution. Elizabeth faced the most insidious assault. As she attempted to contact newspapers and reform organizations to share her evidence of network activities, she discovered that her reputation in the suffrage movement had been systematically destroyed. Women she had considered close allies were now spreading rumors about her mental stability, her true political motivations, and her family's corrupt influences on her activism. More seriously, Elizabeth began receiving visits from medical professionals who claimed to be concerned about her psychological health. These doctors, who all had impressive credentials and official authorizations, suggested that she was experiencing a nervous breakdown related to her father's death and needed immediate psychiatric treatment. Elizabeth realized that the network was preparing to have her committed to a mental institution where she could be held indefinitely and subjected to treatments that would either break her resistance or eliminate her entirely. The psychological evaluation Dr. Blackwood had conducted provided documentation that could be used to justify involuntary commitment. By 4 p.m., the 4 siblings understood that Protocol 7 was designed to force them into total isolation before presenting them with a final ultimatum. They would be stripped of all resources, all social connections, and all legal protections before being offered one last opportunity to comply with network demands. But Elizabeth's contact with the resistance network had provided them with a potential solution. The resistance letter had included instructions for reaching a federal prosecutor named Robert Harrison, the same man who was William's assassination target, who had been conducting a covert investigation of organized crime connections to wealthy families. The letter explained that Harrison was one of a small group of federal officials who had been investigating the network for months, but who lacked sufficient evidence to proceed with prosecutions. The resistance network had been slowly providing Harrison with information about network activities, but they needed family members willing to testify about their direct experiences. Elizabeth used a series of coded messages transmitted through suffrage movement contacts to arrange a meeting with Harrison for that evening. The meeting would take place at a location outside the network's surveillance zone, but getting there would require the siblings to evade both network operatives and federal agents who were monitoring their movements. At 6 p.m., the Willoughby siblings implemented an escape plan based on instructions from the resistance letter. Using techniques developed by the suffrage movement for evading police surveillance during protests, they managed to leave their individual locations without being detected by their assigned watchers. Margaret created a diversion by having a friend contact her house claiming to be a representative of the bank, handling her frozen accounts. While network operatives focused on monitoring this supposed financial meeting, Margaret slipped out through her kitchen and made her way to the rendezvous point, using a route that avoided major streets and known surveillance locations. William used his legal contacts to arrange a fake client meeting at a downtown hotel. While network assets monitored the hotel lobby, William exited through a service entrance and traveled to the meeting location using public transportation and careful route selection to avoid detection. Thomas leveraged his political connections to create the impression that he was meeting with party officials to discuss his response to the federal investigation. Network surveillance focused on the supposed political meeting, while Thomas actually traveled to the rendezvous point through a series of transfers designed to lose any tail. Elizabeth used suffrage movement safe house protocols to disappear from her normal routine and travel to the meeting location, using an underground network of women's rights activists who had experience evading police surveillance during political demonstrations. At 8 p.m., all four siblings successfully arrived at the designated meeting location, a private room in a Cambridge boarding house that was operated by Resistance Network sympathizers. Federal prosecutor Robert Harrison was waiting for them with a small team of federal agents who specialized in organized crime investigations. Harrison was a man in his early 40s with the careful demeanor of someone who had spent years investigating dangerous criminals. He listened as the Willoughby siblings presented their evidence of network activities, including the assignment letters, surveillance documents, financial records, and psychological evaluation reports. "What you're describing confirms suspicions we've had for years," Harrison said after reviewing their materials. "We've been aware of unusual patterns in how certain criminal investigations have been handled, how certain wealthy families seem to be immune to legal consequences, and how people who threaten powerful interests tend to disappear or die in suspicious circumstances." He showed them a map marked with locations where the federal investigation had identified suspicious deaths and disappearances over the past decade. The pattern matched exactly what the Willoughby evidence documented about network elimination activities. "The problem has always been getting sufficient evidence to proceed with prosecutions," Harrison explained. "The network operates through intermediaries and cover organizations that make it difficult to establish direct connections between wealthy families and actual crimes. Your evidence provides the direct testimony we need to begin dismantling this conspiracy." But Harrison also warned them about the enormous risks they would face as witnesses against the network. "These people have demonstrated their ability to reach targets in federal custody, to manipulate court proceedings, and to eliminate threats regardless of government protection. If you agree to testify, you'll be marked for death, and we can't guarantee your safety." Elizabeth studied the federal agents who had accompanied Harrison, wondering how many of them might be network assets. "How do we know this isn't a trap? How do we know the network hasn't infiltrated your investigation?" Harrison's response was both reassuring and terrifying. "You don't. The network's infiltration of government agencies is so extensive that we have to assume any major operation could be compromised. We've been conducting this investigation using only agents who have been carefully vetted and isolated from normal federal communication channels." He opened a briefcase and showed them identification documents for new identities that could be provided if they agreed to enter federal witness protection. "If you testify against the network, you'll have to disappear permanently. New names, new locations, new lives completely separated from everything you've known." William realized the full implications of Harrison's offer. "We're not just being asked to testify against our family's crimes. We're being asked to disappear forever and live in hiding for the rest of our lives." Margaret thought about the charitable work she had devoted her life to, understanding that cooperation with federal authorities would mean abandoning every cause she had supported and every relationship she had built. What guarantee do we have that testimony will actually bring down the network? What if we sacrifice everything and the prosecutions fail? Harrison's answer was brutally honest. "No guarantee. We believe we can prosecute successfully, but the network has resources and connections that could still allow them to escape justice. You'd be risking everything for the possibility of justice, not the certainty of it." Thomas considered the political implications of the federal investigation. "If this network includes the people you suspect, Prosecuting them will destabilize American politics and business in ways that could have catastrophic consequences. Which is exactly why it has to be done, Harrison replied. A criminal conspiracy that includes some of America's most powerful families represents a fundamental threat to democratic institutions. If we don't expose and prosecute this network, they'll continue expanding their influence until they essentially control the government. As the meeting continued past midnight, the Willoughby siblings faced their final decision. They could cooperate with federal authorities and spend the rest of their lives in hiding, hoping that their testimony would bring down a criminal network that had operated with impunity for decades. Or they could attempt to disappear on their own and hope to escape both federal prosecution and network elimination. There was no third option. The network would never allow them to return to their previous lives, and the federal investigation would never allow them to escape the consequences of their family's crimes. Either way, the people they had been were dying that night. Elizabeth made the decision that sealed their fate. We'll testify, but we want guarantees that this investigation will target every family involved in the network, not just the ones who are politically expendable. Harrison nodded grimly. That's the plan. We either bring down the entire conspiracy, or we accomplish nothing. Partial prosecutions would just allow the network to reorganize and continue operating. As federal agents began the process of creating new identities for the Willoughby siblings, Dr. Harrison Blackwood was receiving reports that Protocol 7 had failed. The family had evaded surveillance and disappeared, probably into federal custody. For the first time in the network's history, a complete family had successfully resisted recruitment and escaped elimination. Protocol 8, the network's final contingency for catastrophic security breaches, was about to be implemented. This protocol involved eliminating not just the immediate threats, but everyone who had been exposed to information about network operations, including federal agents, resistance network members, and anyone else who might possess dangerous knowledge. The battle for the soul of the Willoughby family was over, but the war for the survival of America's most powerful criminal conspiracy was just beginning. The federal investigation that followed the Willoughby siblings' testimony would become known as Operation Bloodline, the largest organized crime prosecution in American history up to that point. Between November 1923 and March 1925, federal agents arrested 347 individuals across 23 states, seized assets worth over $50 million, and exposed a criminal network that had operated with impunity for nearly half a century. But the true cost of bringing down Conrad Willoughby's legacy would be measured not in dollars or prison sentences, but in the lives destroyed by decades of systematic violence and the families torn apart by the choice between conscience and survival. Federal prosecutor Robert Harrison's investigation revealed that the network had eliminated over 800 people between 1869 and 1923, not just the direct victims of Conrad's frontier operations, but 5 decades of witnesses, investigators, business rivals, and family members who had threatened the conspiracy's secrecy. The scope of the killing was staggering, representing what Harrison described as the longest-running murder enterprise in American criminal history. The Willoughby siblings' testimony provided the foundation for prosecutions that reached into the highest levels of American society. Railroad magnate Collis Huntington's estate was revealed to have been built partly on profits from Conrad's operations. Steel baron Andrew Carnegie's charitable foundations had been used to launder money from network activities. Even former members of President Grant's administration were exposed as having participated in the conspiracy. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came from Dr. Harrison Blackwood's personal records, seized during a pre-dawn raid on his Beacon Hill mansion. Hidden in a secret vault beneath his library were detailed files documenting the network's breeding program, a systematic effort to identify and cultivate future generations of criminals from wealthy families. The program had operated like a eugenics experiment, with network psychologists studying the children of member families to determine which ones showed optimal characteristics for criminal activity. Children who displayed appropriate levels of intelligence, emotional detachment, and susceptibility to manipulation were groomed for leadership roles within the organization. Those who showed excessive empathy, moral rigidity, or resistance to authority were either eliminated or subjected to psychological conditioning designed to break their resistance. Elizabeth Willoughby's psychological evaluation had been part of this breeding program. The network hadn't been trying to recruit her. They had been trying to manufacture her, using decades of manipulation to create the perfect criminal asset. Her resistance to their conditioning represented a failure of their psychological engineering, a flaw in their system that ultimately led to their exposure. Margaret Willoughby's charitable work had been similarly manipulated. The network had been using her foundation not just to identify victims, but to study how charitable organizations could be weaponized for criminal purposes. Her genuine desire to help vulnerable populations had been exploited to develop more effective methods of targeting and isolating potential victims. William's legal career had been cultivated to provide the network with inside information about federal investigations and court proceedings. His professional success had been entirely dependent on network influence, and his legal expertise had been used to help other network families avoid prosecution for decades. Thomas's political ambitions had been encouraged because the network needed assets within government who could influence legislation, control investigations, and provide early warning of potential threats to their operations. His gubernatorial campaign had been funded by network money, and his platform had been designed to advance network interests while appearing to champion reform. The siblings had never been free individuals making independent choices. They had been products of a criminal breeding program, groomed from birth to serve the network's interests. Their resistance to recruitment represented not just personal moral courage, but a fundamental failure of the psychological conditioning that was supposed to guarantee their compliance. Dr. Blackwood's files revealed that the Willoughby family wasn't unique. Similar breeding programs had been conducted with dozens of wealthy families across America, with network psychologists studying multiple generations to perfect their manipulation techniques. Children who proved unsuitable for criminal activity were eliminated, while those who showed promise were subjected to increasingly sophisticated conditioning designed to remove moral obstacles to murder. The network had essentially been conducting a decades-long experiment in manufacturing human monsters, using America's wealthiest families as their laboratory and their children as test subjects. The scope of the psychological manipulation was so extensive that many network members had no idea they were participants in a criminal conspiracy. They believed their actions were normal expressions of wealth and power. Elizabeth's exposé of the network's psychological conditioning protocols sparked a national scandal that reached far beyond the criminal prosecutions. Medical professionals who had participated in the breeding program were stripped of their licenses. Universities that had provided research support were investigated for ethical violations. Charitable organizations that had been used as cover for network operations lost their tax-exempt status, but the most profound impact was on the families themselves. As the investigation expanded, hundreds of wealthy American dynasties discovered that their children had been subjected to psychological manipulation without their knowledge. Parents who had believed they were providing their children with the best possible education and opportunities learned that they had actually been delivering them to a criminal organization for conditioning. The network's breeding program had created what federal investigators termed manufactured psychopaths, individuals who had been systematically trained from childhood to view violence as a normal business practice and human life as a commodity to be traded or eliminated as necessary. Many of these individuals had committed multiple murders without recognizing their actions as crimes, believing instead that they were simply fulfilling their family and social obligations. Margaret Willoughby's testimony revealed how the network had used charitable work to normalize violence against vulnerable populations. Women and children in orphanages and shelters had been treated as inventory, available for elimination whenever network clients required victims for their entertainment. The charitable foundations that were supposed to protect these populations had instead been delivering them to predators. William's legal expertise provided crucial insights into how the network had manipulated the justice system for decades. Judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials had been either corrupted or eliminated, creating parallel legal systems that protected network interests while prosecuting anyone who threatened them. Many prominent legal cases had been decided not on evidence or law, but on network influence and intimidation. Thomas's political connections exposed how the network had shaped American policy for decades. Legislation, regulatory decisions, and government contracts had been influenced by network priorities rather than public interest. Political careers had been made and destroyed based on individuals' willingness to serve network objectives. Elizabeth's involvement in the women's suffrage movement revealed how the network had infiltrated and manipulated reform movements to serve their own purposes. Progressive causes had been used as cover for criminal activities, with genuine reformers being eliminated when they became inconvenient to network operations. The federal prosecutions that resulted from Operation Bloodline sent shockwaves through American society. Former senators, governors, and judges were convicted of conspiracy, murder, and racketeering. Major corporations were revealed to have been founded with blood money from network operations. Charitable foundations that had funded hospitals and schools were exposed as money laundering operations for organized crime. But the network's influence had been so extensive that bringing down the entire conspiracy proved impossible. For every network member who was prosecuted, others escaped justice by fleeing the country, destroying evidence, or using their remaining influence to avoid charges. The investigation succeeded in dismantling the organization's formal structure, but many of its members simply reorganized into smaller, more secretive groups. Dr. Harrison Blackwood himself escaped prosecution by committing suicide in his jail cell, but not before providing federal agents with detailed information about network operations in exchange for protection for his own family. His final testimony revealed that the network had been planning to expand its operations internationally, with similar breeding programs being established in England, France, and Germany. The Willoughby siblings paid a heavy price for their decision to resist their family's legacy. Federal witness protection provided them with new identities and relocated them to different parts of the country, but they could never return to Boston or contact anyone from their previous lives. The wealth and social position they had inherited was forfeit, leaving them to build new lives with nothing but their consciences. Elizabeth became a teacher in a small Oregon town, where she spent 30 years educating children while carefully avoiding any mention of her past. She never married, never had children, and never formed close relationships that might expose her true identity. Her sacrifice had helped bring down a criminal conspiracy, but it had also condemned her to a life of isolation and secrecy. Margaret moved to California, where she worked as a nurse in charity hospitals. She spent her remaining years caring for the same type of vulnerable populations that her family's network had once targeted for elimination. Her work was her penance, an attempt to balance the scales for the crimes committed in her family's name. William established a small legal practice in rural Montana, where he provided free legal services to farmers and ranchers who couldn't afford proper representation. He specialized in cases involving corporate exploitation and government corruption, using his knowledge of how powerful interests manipulated the legal system to help ordinary people fight back against injustice. Thomas abandoned politics entirely and became a high school history teacher in Nebraska. He spent decades teaching students about the importance of moral courage and the dangers of unchecked power. Though he could never explain that his lessons were based on personal experience with America's darkest secrets, none of the siblings ever saw each other again after entering witness protection. Federal authorities believed that keeping them separated provided better security, and the siblings themselves understood that contact between them would create security risks that could result in their deaths. They lived and died as strangers, connected only by their shared decision to choose conscience over survival. The investigation also revealed the ultimate fate of Conrad Willoughby himself. Federal agents discovered that he had indeed returned to Europe in 1883, where he had established similar operations in several countries before dying of natural causes in a Swiss sanitarium in 1902. His body had been cremated and his ashes scattered, ensuring that even in death, he left no traces that could be used to hold him accountable for his crimes. But Conrad's most lasting legacy wasn't the wealth he had accumulated or the network he had helped establish. It was the psychological conditioning techniques he had developed for manufacturing human monsters. His methods had been studied and refined by network psychologists for decades, creating a systematic approach to destroying human empathy and moral reasoning that was far more effective than simple violence or intimidation. The breeding program documents revealed that Conrad had been influenced by early studies in psychology and criminology that were being conducted in European universities during the 1860s. His operations in frontier towns had been designed not just to provide services to wealthy clients, but to test theories about how environmental factors could be used to modify human behavior and moral development. The young women who had been murdered in places like the Prairie Rose Saloon hadn't just been victims of sexual violence. They had been subjects in psychological experiments designed to understand how extreme trauma affected human consciousness and resistance to authority. Conrad had been studying their responses to various forms of abuse to develop more effective techniques for breaking down psychological defenses. These techniques had then been applied to the children of network families, using controlled trauma and manipulation to create individuals who could commit violence without experiencing normal emotional responses. The network's success in creating multiple generations of compliant killers had been built on research conducted using the corpses of Conrad's frontier victims. Elizabeth's psychological evaluation had revealed that she was what network scientists termed a conditioning failure, someone whose moral development had resisted their manipulation techniques. Her resistance had provided valuable data about the limitations of their psychological engineering, but it had also marked her as a threat to their entire system. The federal investigation's final report, classified and sealed for national security reasons, concluded that the network's breeding program represented the most systematic attempt to weaponize human psychology in American history. The techniques they had developed were considered so dangerous that the government prohibited any further research into similar methodologies. But the report also warned that the network's psychological conditioning methods had been so successful that many of its products remained active in American society, occupying positions of power in business, government, and social institutions. These individuals had been so thoroughly conditioned that they might continue operating according to network principles even without formal organizational structure. The investigation identified over 200 individuals who had been subjected to network conditioning, but had not been prosecuted due to insufficient evidence of specific crimes. These people remained in positions where they could influence American society, potentially passing network values to future generations through their own families and professional activities. Federal authorities recommended ongoing surveillance of individuals connected to former network families, but budget constraints and political pressure from powerful interests limited the scope of such monitoring. Many potential network assets were allowed to continue their activities under informal supervision that proved largely ineffective. The true extent of the network's influence on American society would never be fully understood. Too many records had been destroyed, too many witnesses had been eliminated, and too many connections had been deliberately obscured to allow for complete reconstruction of their activities. The investigation had exposed the tip of an iceberg, whose full dimensions remained hidden beneath the surface of American respectability. Conclusion, narrativa final. In the end, the Willoughby family's decision to resist their inherited legacy of violence had succeeded in exposing and dismantling one of America's most powerful criminal conspiracies. But their victory had come at the cost of everything they had valued: their identities, their relationships, their social positions, and their family connections. The network Conrad Willoughby had helped establish in the frontier towns of the 1870s had grown into a shadow organization that controlled significant portions of American society for half a century. Its breeding program had produced multiple generations of killers who operated from positions of wealth and respectability, using their social status to commit crimes that would have been impossible for conventional criminals. The psychological conditioning techniques developed through the torture and murder of innocent women in places like the Prairie Rose Saloon had been refined into a systematic method for destroying human empathy and moral reasoning. These techniques had been used to transform the children of America's elite families into weapons that could be deployed against anyone who threatened the interests of wealth and power. The Willoughby siblings' resistance to this conditioning had required them to sacrifice not just their inheritance, but their entire way of life. They had chosen to become martyrs to conscience, trading their privileged positions for the uncertain hope that their testimony might prevent future victims and expose the true nature of American power. Their story serves as a reminder that privilege and power often come with prices that are hidden from public view, and that the most respectable families and institutions may be built on foundations of violence that have been carefully concealed from historical memory. The wealth and influence that shape American society may be connected to crimes that occurred generations ago, but continue to affect contemporary events through the networks and systems established by earlier criminals. The resistance shown by Elizabeth Chew, Margaret Chew, William, and Thomas Willoughby demonstrates that even the most sophisticated psychological manipulation cannot entirely destroy human moral capacity. Despite decades of conditioning designed to prepare them for lives of violence, they retained enough conscience to recognize the evil they were being asked to perpetuate, and found the courage to resist it. Their choice to expose their family's crimes rather than continue them represents a victory of individual moral courage over systemic corruption, even though that victory required them to surrender everything they had previously valued. They became examples of how ordinary people can resist extraordinary evil, even when that resistance seems to offer no hope of personal benefit or survival. The network they helped bring down had operated successfully for decades, because it understood that most people will choose personal survival over moral principle when faced with life-or-death decisions. The Willoughby siblings proved that this understanding, while generally accurate, was not universal. Some individuals will choose conscience over survival, even when that choice guarantees suffering and loss. Their story also reveals how criminal organizations can survive and evolve across generations by embedding themselves within legitimate institutions and using psychological manipulation to ensure compliance from their members. The network's breeding program represented a sophisticated understanding of how human moral development could be corrupted through controlled environment and systematic conditioning. The fact that such an organization could operate for 50 years while including some of America's most prominent families demonstrates the inadequacy of conventional law enforcement when confronting systemic corruption that extends across multiple institutions and jurisdictions. The network's eventual exposure required the moral courage of individuals willing to sacrifice everything, combined with the determination of law enforcement officials willing to pursue investigations regardless of political pressure. Reflexion final, a call to action. So, what's your opinion about all of this? The Willoughby family's legacy forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the true sources of wealth and power in American society. How many prominent families built their fortunes on violence that has been carefully erased from historical memory? How many respected institutions serve as covers for activities that would horrify the public if they were fully exposed? How many psychological conditioning techniques developed through historical violence continue to shape contemporary society in ways we don't recognize? The story of Conrad Willoughby's frontier operations and their evolution into a nationwide criminal conspiracy spanning multiple generations reveals patterns that may still exist in different forms today. The network's breeding program, its infiltration of government and law enforcement, its use of charitable organizations as cover for criminal activities, and its systematic elimination of threats all represent methodologies that could be adapted to contemporary circumstances. The resistance shown by the Willoughby siblings in 1923 provides a template for how individuals can resist systemic corruption even when that resistance requires enormous personal sacrifice. Their choice to prioritize moral principles over survival demonstrates that human conscience cannot be entirely eliminated through manipulation and conditioning, even when such techniques are applied systematically over multiple generations. If you found this investigation into the Willoughby family's dark legacy compelling, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We dive deep into the hidden histories that shaped American society, exposing the connections between historical violence and contemporary power structures that most people never learn about in school. Share this video with anyone who's interested in understanding the true foundations of American wealth and influence. Help us spread awareness about how historical crimes continue to affect modern society through the networks and systems established by earlier generations of criminals. The more people understand these connections, the better equipped we are to recognize and resist similar patterns when they emerge in contemporary contexts. And let us know in the comments what other historical mysteries you'd like us to investigate. The Willoughby case is just one example of how America's most respected families may have built their empires on foundations of violence and exploitation. There are countless other stories waiting to be uncovered, other networks waiting to be exposed, other victims waiting to be remembered and honored. The choice made by Elizabeth, Margaret, William, and Thomas Willoughby in 1923 reminds us that we all face similar decisions, perhaps not as dramatic but equally important, about whether to prioritize personal benefit or moral principle when confronted with systemic corruption. Their example shows us that resistance is possible, even against the most powerful and sophisticated criminal organizations. When individuals find the courage to choose conscience over survival,